No one would marry the Cleft-Lipped bride rejected 29 times, until a scarred gunsmith did. The rifle came in on a Tuesday, wrapped in a saddle blanket that smelled like creek water and old blood. A Henry repeater, 66 model, the receiver so fouled with carbon and rust I could see the previous owner's neglect in every pore of the metal. I set it on my bench without thinking much about it, because rifles came in all the time with stories I didn't need to know. A man dropped it off, said he'd bought it at an estate sale outside Laramie, didn't say whose estate, didn't look me in the eye when he said it. I didn't ask. That's one of the rules of the trade. You take the work, you do it right, you give it back. What happened before and what happens after, that's not yours. I'd been running my shop in Caldwell, Kansas for 11 years by then. 11 years is long enough to learn which questions not to ask. The fire had taken the left side of my face in '68, the year I turned 32. I was working late in a forge over in Newton, not my forge. I was hired on for a shop that repaired agricultural equipment, plowshares and baling hooks and the like, nothing so fine as what I do now, and a coke pocket in the fuel caught wrong. The bellows pushed a jet of burning gas up and sideways, and it hit me before I could turn. I don't remember pain exactly. I remember sound. I remember the sound my skin made. I remember dropping to my knees on the packed dirt floor and thinking, with strange clarity, that the job wasn't finished. I don't tell people that. I've told maybe 3 people that in my life, and 2 of them are dead. The left eye survived, which is more than I deserved by luck. The ear is gone, there's a ridge of scar tissue where it was, shaped something like a walnut shell if you look at it a certain way in lamplight, and most people don't look at it at all, because most people can't hold their gaze on the left side of my face for more than a second or 2. I learned that early. There's a flinch that polite people do, a very quick tightening around the eyes, and then they fix their attention on my right side and speak to that. I got used to it. I am used to it. I don't say that as a complaint. It's just a fact about the world, the way a canyon is a fact, the way winter is. I set up in Caldwell because it was a cattle town on the Kishom Trail, and a cattle town always needs a gunsmith. Drovers come through with weapons that have been banged against saddle leather and soaked in river crossings and dropped in stampedes. Ranch hands bring revolvers with cylinders so gummed they won't turn. Lawmen bring rifles they've been using as fence post levers. I never ran out of work, and work kept me from thinking about things I'd rather not think about, and that was arrangement enough. I lived alone. I had a room behind the shop, 8 feet by 10, a cot and a washstand and 2 shelves for books. I read a lot, history mostly, some natural philosophy. I kept a vegetable plot behind the building that nobody saw, which is where I went when I needed air that didn't smell like solvent and metal filings. Tomatoes, beans, winter squash. I am not a man who needs much. I want that understood before I go any further. I was not a man waiting to be saved. I had made my peace with my life. I'm telling you this so you know what I was when she walked in. She came in on a Wednesday, the day after the fouled Henry arrived. I was at the bench with the Henry's barrel in a cleaning jig, running a bronze brush through it for the 4th pass, and I heard the door. I have a bell above the door, not a shop bell, just a brass cowbell I got at an auction for 15 cents, and it makes a flat, tuneless clunk when the door opens. I looked up. She was perhaps 30 years old. Medium height on the lean side, wearing a calico dress that had been washed so many times the blue had gone the color of a winter sky at noon, and a canvas coat over it that was too large for her, a man's coat. Her hair was brown and pinned back with a practicality that suggested she didn't think about her hair much. She was carrying a small valise, the kind a person carries when they're traveling light and have learned not to accumulate things they might have to leave behind. The cleft was there, the split in her upper lip, healed over long since but permanent, the scar tissue paler than the rest of her skin, the lip pulled slightly upward on the left side. Some people born with that have surgery and come out of it looking almost normal, depending on who does the cutting and how young they are when it's done. She hadn't had that, or hadn't had it done well, or the healing had gone crooked. I don't know which. What I can tell you is that it was the first thing you saw when you looked at her face, the way the left side of my face is the first thing people see when they look at me. I looked at it for maybe 2 seconds. Then I looked at her eyes, which were gray and very clear and watching me with a flatness that I recognized, a watchfulness that said, "Go ahead, say it or don't say it. I've seen every version of this." I said, "What do you need?" She said, "I have a pistol that doesn't fire." "Bring it here." She came to the counter. I had an oak counter along the front of the shop, scarred from years of weapons being set down on it, and set down the valise and opened it and took out a revolver wrapped in cloth. She set it on the counter and unwrapped it. A Colt single-action army, 1873, the first year of production. Standard barrel. The finish had worn off the cylinder and the grip was wrapped in boot leather and tied with wire because the original grips were gone. I picked it up. The action was frozen. I could feel it before I tried the hammer. The cylinder wouldn't rotate freely. I tilted it toward the window and looked into the barrel. Clean, which was interesting. When did it stop firing? 3 years ago. 3 years ago, and you're bringing it in now. I've been in 7 different towns in 3 years. This is the first one I've stayed in long enough. I put the Colt in the jig and got my magnifying loupe and looked at the action. The hand that rotated the cylinder had bent, not broken, bent, and was catching the cylinder stop in a way that locked everything up. An easy fix, 40 minutes of work if I didn't strip any screws, an hour if I did. I'd seen worse from weapons that had been used hard. Be ready tomorrow, I said. How much? $1.50. She nodded. She wrapped the valise back up carefully, like she was accustomed to taking care of things, and latched it and turned to go. Staying in Caldwell? I don't know why I asked. I didn't usually ask. She stopped. For a while, she said. I'm looking for work. Do you know who's hiring in town? I thought about it. Hannigan's Dry Goods needs someone to keep books. Mrs. Hannigan mentioned it last week. I don't know if it's still open. I can keep books. Go in the morning. She opens at 8. She nodded again and went out. The cowbell made its flat clunk behind her. I looked at the Colt for a while. Then I went back to the Henry's barrel. That was the first conversation. I want you to hold it in your mind because it was also, in a way, the whole conversation. The whole thing between us compressed into those few minutes. 2 people who were used to being looked at wrong, looking at each other straight. 2 people who had learned to open with the practical, the functional, the job at hand. Because the practical was safe ground and the rest of it was where you could get hurt. Her name was Nora Voss. I learned that when she came back for the Colt. She'd gotten the job at Hannigan's. She told me that while I was finishing up the paperwork, I kept a ledger, everything in and out, every weapon with a number and a description and the work done, and she told it without particular satisfaction, the way you report a fact. The job existed. She was qualified. She had it now. You're good at bookkeeping? I asked. I'm good at most things I put my hands to, she said. Not bragging, just the same flatness, another fact. I wrote out the ticket and slid it across the counter with the Colt. She picked up the revolver and dry-fired it once, twice. The cylinder rotated cleanly. She nodded. Where are you from? I asked. I still don't know entirely why I kept asking her things. It wasn't a habit of mine. She looked at me. The gray eyes took a moment. Ohio originally, she said. Then Missouri, then several places I don't count. Why don't you count them? Because I didn't choose to be in them. She paid the $1.50 in exact coin. She'd counted it out before she came. I could tell by how she set it on the counter without checking, and left. I stood at the counter for longer than I needed to before going back to work. Caldwell in the spring of 1879 was a town in the middle of finding out what it was going to be. The cattle trade was still running strong, the Kishome still active, and the drovers still came through in their thousands in the summer months. And that meant the saloons and the gambling houses did well, and the jail did well, and the doctor did well, and I did well. But there were also families, more every year, homesteaders who had come down from the northern territories looking for land that wasn't broken yet. And they wanted churches and schools, and dry goods stores, and a future that looked different from the one the drovers were living. The town was running 2 lives at the same time, and hadn't yet decided which one to keep. I had a place in both worlds and neither. The drovers brought me guns. The homesteaders brought me guns. Neither invited me to supper. That was fine. I am not a man who needs supper invitations. What I noticed in the weeks after Nora Voss came to pick up her Colt was that I started noticing when she was on the street. I'd look up from whatever I was doing, and she'd be crossing Maine with a bag from Hannigan's, or she'd be outside the feed store in conversation with one of the farmers who'd stopped in town for supplies. Or she'd be sitting on the bench outside the post office reading something, a letter or a paper, with the same focused stillness she brought to everything. She'd rented a room above the laundry. I found this out from Mrs. Hannigan, who told me without my asking, because Mrs. Hannigan liked to tell me things, liked to have reasons to come into the shop and stand at the counter and talk at me. That girl has a face for it. Mrs. Hannigan told me one afternoon. I had stopped listening to her content some years before, but paid enough attention to pick up the thread when she said something that snagged me. "A face for what?" I said. "For being alone. She doesn't seem to mind it." I thought about that. I thought about the gray eyes watching me from across the counter, the watchfulness that said, "Go ahead. I've seen every version of this." "Some people make their peace," I said. Mrs. Hannigan looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I suppose they do," she said. She came into the shop again 6 weeks after the Colt. Not for work, or not for work I could see, but because she'd been walking past and apparently decided to come in. She said she'd seen a rifle in the window, one I had on display, and .73 Winchester, and she wanted to look at it. I took it out of the window cradle and handed it to her across the counter. She handled it correctly, which I always noticed in a customer. A lot of people take a rifle like they're afraid of it, holding it away from their body or pointing it somewhere stupid. She took it with her right hand at the forestock, the barrel tilted down and away, and she looked at the action and the receiver without touching anything she hadn't been invited to touch. "You've used rifles," I said. "My father had a farm. We were a long way from neighbors." She handed it back. "It's a fine-looking thing. It shoots as good as it looks." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the row of weapons on the rear wall rack. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was 17. Apprenticed to a man in Pittsburgh, moved west when I was 24. "You like it?" "I do." "What do you like about it?" I thought about how to answer that. Nobody asked me that, not in a serious way. "The tolerances," I said. "There's no room for approximate in a firearm. If you're off by 1/1000th of an inch in the wrong place, it doesn't work, or it works wrong, which is worse. There's something satisfying about a thing where the standard is exact." She looked at me, not the quick look and the flinch, the steady look. "Yes," she said. "I understand that." She bought a box of cartridges for the Colt, .45 Colt, 48 cents, and left. I spent the evening trying to figure out what she'd meant by that. I understood that. I decided she'd meant the satisfaction of exact standards, of a thing that was either right or wrong, no room for the uncertain middle where so much of life was lived, where a person was either acceptable or not, attractive or not, worth talking to or not, and the judgment came down in 2 seconds whether it was fair or not. I understood that too. Summer hit Caldwell the way it always did, like something falling. The drovers came up from Texas, and the town swelled and got loud, and the jail filled on weekends, and I stayed at my bench and worked. In June alone, I had 47 repairs come through, which was a record. I took on a boy named Amos, 16 years old, son of one of the livery men, to sweep and fetch and do the simple cleaning work, and paid him 30 cents a day, which was fair for what I asked. Nora was still at Hannigan's. I knew because I saw her, not because I asked. She'd settled into Caldwell the way water settles into a low place. She was simply there, as if she'd always been there, as if there was nothing remarkable about her being there. She'd become a known quantity in a town that had spent its history on the transient. People liked her, I thought, or respected her, which is not always the same thing but was, in her case, inseparable. I saw her once in July out behind the dry goods store in the alley, dealing with a man I recognized as Dix Farnsworth, one of the drovers who came through every season, a big man who drank too much and had a habit of standing too close to women and not backing off when they asked. I'd fixed his revolver twice, and both times had wanted to charge him double, though I hadn't. I saw from across the street that he was standing close and she was standing still and saying something to him in a low voice. I started across the street. By the time I got to the mouth of the alley, she had Farnsworth backed against the wall, not with force, with something else, with stillness, with a quality of absolute no that had enough weight in it that Farnsworth, 6'2" and 230 pounds of Texas drover, had gone quiet and was looking down at his boots. I stopped. She said one more thing to him that I didn't catch and turned and walked out of the alley. She saw me standing there. A small nod, nothing more, and she went back to the store. I looked at Farnsworth. He was still looking at his boots. "Get out of this alley," I said. He got out. I went back to my shop and thought about what I'd seen. Not the event itself, but the way she'd handled it. Not with fear, not with apology. With a precision that reminded me of what I did at the bench. The exact amount of force in the exact right place. Nothing wasted, nothing showy. I kept thinking about it for longer than made sense. She came to me in August with a different problem. There was a man in town, a recently arrived man, a farmer from Indiana named Collier who had a son of about 12 and had lost his wife the previous winter. He'd been coming into Hannigan's most days since he arrived, and Nora had told him politely but plainly that she wasn't interested in his attentions. He'd taken this well enough at first, and then, in the way some men do, had decided to take it as a kind of challenge. And now he was coming in twice a day and standing at the counter talking at her even when she was busy. And the previous afternoon he'd followed her for 2 blocks when she left work. She told me this standing at my counter, in the same tone she used for everything, level, factual. But there was something at the edges of it, a tiredness that was different from her usual register. "Why are you telling me?" I asked. "Because you know everyone in this town and I don't, and because I want to know if there's anything I should know about him before I decide how to handle it." That was a good reason, a practical reason. I appreciated it. "Collier," I said. "He came in with his boy 2 weeks ago, had a rifle in bad shape. Not a bad man that I could tell. Green. Hasn't learned the difference between pursuing and pestering." "Most men haven't," she said, not unkindly, just another fact. "Do you want me to talk to him?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the row of revolvers behind the counter. "I can manage it myself," she said. "I always have." "I know you can." Another pause. Outside, Main Street was busy, the shout of a drover somewhere, a horse objecting to something. "Yes," she said. "I'd appreciate it if you'd talk to him." I talked to Collier the following morning. He came in to have the rifle's front sight resoldered, which had nothing to do with the conversation, but gave me a reason to have him across the counter from me. I told him plainly what pestering looked like from the outside, and that following a woman from her work was the kind of thing that turned a man into someone the town talked about in a way he didn't want to be talked about. I told him the second time she asked him to stop would be the last polite time, and that the time after that she was likely to handle herself, and he would come out of it with a reputation he didn't need. He went red. He paid for the sight work without looking up from the counter and left. He stopped going to Hannigan's twice a day. He still went once, for supplies he actually needed, which was what she'd said she'd accept. She came in the following Friday and set a jar of preserved peaches on my counter. No explanation, just the jar. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." I looked at the jar. Home canned, the peaches in thick syrup, the lid sealed with beeswax. Someone had put time into that. "Thank you," I said. "You helped me." "It wasn't much." "It was to me," she said. She left. I stood there holding the jar, and I thought, she made those herself. She made those and she brought them here because she wanted to. I ate them that night at the bench while I was working on a Springfield trapjack conversion, eating them with a metal spatula that was the closest thing to a spoon within reach, and they were the best peaches I'd had in years. Maybe the best I'd had since before Newton, since before the fire. I want to stop here and say something about myself that is hard to say, because it requires me to admit to something that men my age, my kind of man, are not in the habit of admitting to. After Newton, after the fire, I had made a decision, not a conscious decision, not a thing I sat down and resolved, but a decision nonetheless, the kind that happens in the body and the bones before the mind gets involved. I had decided that I was not a man that women chose, that that part of life was over for me, or that it had never properly begun, and that what lay ahead was the work and the room behind the shop and the vegetable garden and the books, and that was enough. It was enough. I believed it. I had built a whole life on believing it, and the life worked, and I was not unhappy. I want you to understand that I was not waiting. I was not a man mooning over what he'd lost. I had accounted for it, put it in the ledger on the lost side, closed the page. And then there was a jar of preserved peaches. I know how that sounds. Preserved peaches. It's not the peaches. It's what the peaches meant, which was, I see you. I wanted to do something for you, not because I owe you, not because I need something from you, because I wanted to. Nobody had done that for me since I could remember. Since before Newton, probably. Since before I was the kind of man people didn't look at straight. I ate the peaches with a spatula, and I sat very still for a long time and tried not to think about what I was thinking about. September brought the tail end of the drive season and a change in the weather that came faster than most years. A cold front dropping down from the north in the second week of the month. And suddenly there were fires going in every building in Caldwell, and the mud on Main Street froze solid overnight, and the drovers were hurrying south with what remained of their herds. I had a rhythm with Nora by then, not a planned thing. She came by the shop most Fridays on her way home from Hannigan's, and she'd stop and look at whatever was on the bench, and I'd tell her what I was working on, and she'd ask questions, real questions, not polite ones, and I'd answer them, and then she'd go home. Sometimes she brought something. Once a piece of pie from the bakery, a rhubarb pie wrapped in a cloth. Once she brought me a book she'd found at the general store in the next town, a history of the fur trade that she'd thought I'd like and had bought and carried 20 miles on the stage without being asked. I'd been speechless at that. I don't go speechless easily. I'd asked her, one Friday in late September, why she was in Caldwell. Why she'd stopped here, of all the towns between Ohio and the Pacific. She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer. I kept moving, she said, because I thought the right place was further on, and then I got tired of that. I got tired of expecting somewhere to be better. She looked at the bench, at the Sharp's rifle I had disassembled across it. Caldwell seemed like a place where a person could just work and not be remarkable, so I stopped. Has it been that? I asked. A pause, mostly. What's the exception? She looked at me, the gray eyes. You, she said. I said nothing. I didn't know what to say. You don't look at me like I need explaining, she said. Most people, when they look at my face, there's a question in it. Even kind people, even people who have been kind to me for years, there's still a question. She was quiet a moment. You don't have that. I know what it's like, I said, the question. I know you do. We were quiet together for a little while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the least uncomfortable silence I'd been in with another person since I could remember. What happened? She said with a tilt of her head toward the left side of my face. Not the flinch, not avoidance, just what happened. I told her about Newton. I told her about the sound the forge made and the strange clarity of my thoughts in the moment before the pain came. I told her about the 6 months in the hospital in Wichita and the surgeon who'd saved the eye and done what he could with the tissue and not been able to do more. I told her that the worst part wasn't the face. The face was what it was, but the 2 years afterward when I'd believed, truly believed, that I was finished, that whatever I might have been was gone. What changed that? She said. Work, I said. Somebody put a revolver in my hands that needed fixing, and I fixed it, and then somebody else did. And eventually it was clear that the thing I was good at hadn't been touched by the fire. The fire got the outside of me. The thing I was good at was still in here. I tapped my temple. Still in these hands. She looked at my hands. The right hand, which was normal. The left, which had its own scarring from the same event, a slight curling of the 2 outer fingers that I'd spent years learning to work around. The tolerances, she said. The tolerances. I should tell you about the 29. I knew about them by then. The whole town knew, because small towns know everything, and because the story of Nora Voss had preceded her to Caldwell in the way that a certain kind of story precedes a person. 29 men had come to meet her, been introduced to her, been given the opportunity to see if they'd make a match with her, over the course of about 10 years, starting when she was 20 and running until she left Ohio for good. Some had been arranged by her family, her father, a well-meaning practical man who believed his daughter's difficulty was a problem to be solved, and some had been arranged by neighbors or ministers or the cousin in Missouri who meant well. Widowers, mostly. Men who'd been told that Nora Voss was a capable woman, a hard worker, smart, good with accounts, a fine cook, a solid, practical person who would make a good wife. All of which was true. 29 men had met her, and 29 had passed. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what that meant or why it happened. A cleft lip is visible from 10 feet away. In the world I live in and the world she grew up in, a woman's face is a significant part of the ledger when a man is deciding whether to marry her. And I understand that even if I don't admire it, because the same calculus was being applied to me on the other side, and I had understood it as a practical fact for over a decade. I understood it. That didn't mean it was right. What I thought about, lying in my cot in the 8x10 room in the nights of September and October, was not the 29. It was the woman who had endured 29 rejections and still came out of it without apology or anger or the particular hardness that rejection, applied consistently, tends to produce in a person. She was not hard. She was careful in the way you are when you've learned that trust is a thing you spend slowly, but she was not hard. I thought about what it had taken to survive those 29 without becoming hard. I thought about Dick's Farnsworth backed against the alley wall. I thought about the book she'd brought me from 20 miles away. I thought about a lot of things, lying in the dark in October, listening to the wind come off the plains. I am going to tell you about the night of the 15th of October, and I'm going to tell it plainly, because the plain version is the true version and it doesn't need decoration. She came by on a Friday, her usual time, and something was different. Not in her face was the same, but in the quality of her stillness, which was usually a settled stillness, and on this evening was a held stillness, the kind a person wears when they're carrying something and haven't decided yet whether to put it down. I asked if she wanted coffee. I had a small stove in the back of the shop, and I usually made coffee around 5 in the afternoon, a habit I'd had since Pittsburgh. She said yes. I made the coffee and brought it out in 2 tin mugs, and set hers on the counter and kept mine and leaned against the bench and waited. She held the mug in both hands and looked at the middle distance for a while. I had a letter today, she said. From my father, a pause. He's found someone, number 30. I set my mug down on the edge of the bench. A man named Aldrich, she said. A farmer in Indiana. A good man, my father says, steady and fair. His first wife died of fever 2 years ago. He has a daughter of 8 who needs a mother, and he has made clear that a woman's appearance is not the foremost consideration in his mind. She said this last part with no particular inflection, reporting it. What do you want to do? I said. I don't know, she looked at me. I've written back to say I'll consider it, because my father has done this 29 times and I can't keep making him feel like he's failed me. He hasn't failed me, he just doesn't know what else to do. She wrapped both hands tighter around the mug. And maybe Aldrich is what I deserve, or what I'll get. I don't know that those are different things. I stood there. I stood there for longer than I should have stood there, turning what she'd just said over in my mind like I'd turn a piece of metal in the lathe, examining it for flaws. What I'll get, I don't know that those are different things. They are different things, I said. Are they? Not a question, a very old tiredness in it. Yes, I said. What you deserve and what's available are not the same thing. The available can be wrong. The available can be 29 kinds of wrong. She looked at me for a long moment. I know what you're saying, she said. I appreciate it, but you're not, she stopped. What? You're not in a position to fix this one, she said gently, not unkindly, very carefully. You're my friend, you've been good to me, but this is. I know what this is, I said. I picked up my mug and turned toward the stove because I needed a moment to think clearly, to think about whether I was about to do something that I should think about much more carefully than I'd thought about it. I thought about the Henry rifle wrapped in a Creekwater saddle blanket. I thought about the Colt with the bent hand in the action. I thought about tolerances, about the exact place where a part has to be, the exact amount of force in the exact right place, and what happened when you were off by 1/1000th of an inch. You get something that doesn't work, or something that works wrong, and working wrong is worse than not working at all. I thought about the preserved peaches. I thought about a woman who had sat across a counter from 29 men, and looked at each of them straight and watched each of them look at her wrong, and had never once, as far as I could tell, bent herself to the shape of what they wanted. I put the mug down on the stove. I turned around. I have something to say to you, I said, and I want you to let me say it before you answer it. She set her mug on the counter. She looked at me. No flinch, the gray eyes steady. I'm not going to tell you what you deserve, I said. You know what you deserve better than I do. What I'm going to tell you is what I know, which is what I've seen. I've seen you handle Farnsworth in that alley. I've seen you keep Hannigan's books in better order than they've been in 10 years, which I know because Hannigan told me in so many words. I've seen you come through the door of this shop 20, 30 times in the last 6 months, and every time ask a question that nobody else thinks to ask. I stopped, started again. I've seen you be kind to a man with half a face and not make it a thing to manage, not make it a project, not act like it was a quality you were generously overlooking. She was very still. I'm not a man who has much to offer, I said. I have a shop that's paid for, not much else. I have work I know how to do well. I have a room that's too small and a vegetable garden and more books than I have shelves for. I'm 53 years old and my face doesn't get easier to look at as I get older, and I am not. I stopped. I had to be honest here. It was the only way to do this. I am not the man you'd have chosen if the world had given you a fair chance at choosing. Don't, she said, quiet but firm. Let me finish. She waited. But I think you'd be choosing Aldrich because he's there and available and your father is tired, not because he's what you want. And I think you know that. And I took a breath. The words were in a place I hadn't been to in a long time, the way a room in a house can close off for years and you forget there's a door. I would rather lose this, I gestured at the space between us, at the shop, at the months of Fridays, than have you go to Indiana and look back at this year and wonder if you chose right. The shop was quiet. Outside, a wagon was passing, the creak of the wheels, the sound of the horses' feet on the frozen street. You're asking me, she said. Yes. Not telling me what I should do. No. Not telling me I'm making a mistake. No, I don't know that you're making a mistake. Aldrich might be a good man, your father might be right. I met her eyes. I'm asking. She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I'd started to reach for my mug again, because my hands needed something to do. Ilias, she said. My name in her voice. She'd never used it that way before, with that weight. I've been asked before, she said. 29 times I've sat across from a man and tried to see if there was something there, tried to see if he was someone who would look at me and see me, not the lip, not the problem, me. She was quiet for a moment. I gave up on that 3 years ago. I told myself I was being foolish and vain, that wanting to be seen was a kind of vanity I couldn't afford. I didn't say anything. You came out from behind your bench to stop Farnsworth. I did. Halfway across the street before you knew if I needed it. Yes. And then you stopped when you saw I had it. You had it. You see me, she said, not rising, not shaking, level and clear. You have since the day I walked in here, and I've been trying not to know that because knowing it meant, she stopped, took a breath. It meant that I was going to have to be brave about something I'd decided not to be brave about anymore. The shop was very quiet. I'm not writing back to my father about Aldrich, she said. I stood still. The words took a moment to arrive. Nora, I'm not writing back to my father about Aldrich, she said again, and I'm not doing this because I have nowhere else to go or because the other option is worse. I want you to be clear on that. I'm clear. Are you? Yes. She came around the counter, which she'd never done before, always counter between us. That had been the geography of us. And she stood close enough that I could see the paleness of the scar along her upper lip and the gray of her eyes in the lamp light, and she put her right hand flat on my chest. Not reaching up for the scar side, not avoiding it. Just her hand on my chest, feeling my heart, which was working harder than usual. I have been told my face was a deficiency, she said, my whole life. I've been told that a man who chose me was settling or charitable or couldn't do better. I have believed that about myself for more years than I want to count. She looked up at me. I'm not going to believe it anymore. I put my hand over hers. The left hand, the one with the 2 curled fingers, and she didn't move or adjust or look down at it. She kept looking at me. All right, I said. All right, she said. I will not tell you that everything was simple after that. It wasn't. Nora had years of a certain way of being to undo, years of holding herself at arm's length from possibility, and I had years of my own variety of the same thing. And when 2 people are trying to unknot that much caution at the same time, there are moments that are hard. Moments when one of us would go quiet in a way the other couldn't read, and we'd have to come back to the practical, to the bench, to the gun she was asking about, or the books we were trading, or the morning routine that settled into itself over the winter. Her stopping for coffee before work, me already at the bench, the flat clunk of the bell, the smell of coffee mixing with oil and metal. We married in December, in the Caldwell Town Hall, with the judge who handled property disputes officiating because the minister was in Wichita for a funeral. Mrs. Hannigan came and cried without apology, which I found more moving than I expected. Amos came and stood in the back corner looking awkward in a collar that was too tight, which made me think for the first time that he'd been something like a son to me for the last 5 months, a thought I filed away for later. 3 other people came who I can't remember the names of now, though they were kind. Nora wore the calico dress, the one that had been washed to winter sky blue. She'd done something different with her hair. I don't know the language for what women do with hair, but it was different, and she looked, I don't have a better word than beautiful. She looked like herself, and herself was beautiful. We moved her things into the room behind the shop that evening, and the room was no longer too small. Or it was still too small, 8 by 10, but it was full in a way that made the size irrelevant. Her father wrote in February. A letter I read over her shoulder while she read it. She offered me that, held the letter so I could see. He was glad. More than glad, she said. She said she could tell from the handwriting, from the extra pressure his pen had put into certain words. Glad and relieved in the way of a man who has been carrying a worry for 10 years and has finally set it down. I thought about what she'd said in October, that she couldn't keep making him feel like he'd failed her, that he'd done this 29 times. I thought about 29 men who'd looked at Nora Voss across a table or across a room and seen the lip and not seen anything else. 29 men who'd made a ledger and put the lip on one side and everything else on the other and come up short. 29 times. I don't have contempt for those men. I know what it is to make a quick judgment from a face because the world has been making quick judgments from my face for over a decade. I know that the flinch is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's just reflex, the body's response to the unexpected. I know the difference most of the time. What I know is that the 31st time she was across a counter from a man, the man looked at her and saw her. Not because I am better than those 29 or wiser or more virtuous. Because I was in the same position she was in, and I knew what it felt like, and so I knew what to do with the knowledge. Sometimes the thing that prepares you for the right thing is the very thing that hurt you. I'm telling this from the distance of a few years now. We're in 82 as I speak this, which makes it 3 years since December. The shop is doing well. Nora does the books now, Hannigan's Loss, and the accounts are in better shape than they've ever been in. She also, it emerged over the course of that first winter, is a better shot than I am, which I take as a personal failing and she takes as a point of mild, regular satisfaction. She was raised to it, she says, long way from neighbors. Amos, the boy who swept and fetched, is 19 now and learning the trade in earnest. I made him an apprentice formally in the spring of 80 with a contract and a salary. He has his father's jaw and his mother's hands, which are good hands, and he will be better than I am in 10 years, which is what you want from an apprentice. The room is still 8 by 10. Nora has solved the bookshelf problem by building a second shelf above the first in a way I would not have thought of, and the overflow lives there with its spines outward. The history and the natural philosophy and the 3 volumes set on metallurgy that she bought me for my birthday in the fall. She bought me that for my birthday, a 3 volume set on metallurgy. She'd ordered it from a catalog out of St. Louis, and it came on the stage in a crate, and she stood there while I opened it with the expression of a person who has done something they knew was right. I looked at the books. I looked at her. You spent too much, I said. You would have spent it on yourself eventually, she said. This way it was a gift. That's an exact thing to do. An exact, precise, no room for approximate thing. That is the woman I married. I think about the Henry rifle sometimes. The one that came in on a Tuesday wrapped in the saddle blanket, the day before she walked through my door. I fixed it. Took 3 days, longer than I expected. The carbon was deep in the receiver, and I had to do some work on the bolt face too, and the man came back for it and paid me and left. I never saw him again. I never found out whose estate the rifle came from, or what the blood in the blanket was about, or where the Henry went after it left my shop. That's usually how it is. A weapon comes in and goes out, and what happened before and after is not yours. You do the work, you hand it back. But I think about that rifle because it came in the day before she did, and because I spent that Tuesday bent over the bench cleaning it and thinking about nothing but the work, the carbon fouling and the fouled gas tube and the misaligned carrier, and the patience required to get it right. And if I'd been doing anything else, I might not have been in the right frame of mind for what came next. I might have been distracted or annoyed or absent in the way you can be when the work isn't going well. Instead, I was present. I was exactly present, bent over a Henry repeater that needed my full attention, and when the cowbell made its flat clunk and I looked up, I was ready to see whatever was there. That's probably too neat. I know it's too neat. Real life doesn't arrange itself that way, one thing preparing another thing in a tidy sequence. But I'm 56 years old, and I've earned the right to notice the things that line up, even if the lining up was accidental. There's one more thing I want to tell you. Late in the winter of that first year, February maybe, we'd had a hard week. A cold snap that went below 0 3 nights running, and the stove in the shop had been working so hard I'd burned through half a quart of wood I hadn't expected to burn. And I'd gone to bed later than usual and was lying there in the dark listening to the wind. And Nora was not asleep. I could tell from her breathing. And after a while she said, into the dark, "Do you ever think about what your life would have been if the fire hadn't happened?" I thought about it honestly, which is the only way to think about a question like that. "Sometimes," I said. "When I was younger, I thought about it constantly. Now it's more like a country I used to live in. I can remember it, but I can't go back." "Do you want to go back?" I thought about the Henry. I thought about the Colt with the bent hand. I thought about a woman standing in an alley with Farnsworth backed against a wall. "No," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned on her side toward me, and I felt her hand on my arm, not the right arm, the left, the one with the two curled fingers and the scar tissue running up to the elbow, and she left it there, her hand wrapped around the scarred forearm, steady and warm. "Good," she said. And that was all. Outside, the plains were dark and cold, and the wind was doing what the wind does. But the stove was ticking as it cooled, and the room was warm, and her hand was on my arm. That's it, that's the whole thing. Everything I was, everything I'd made my peace with, and one woman's hand on the arm the fire had taken. That's what a good woman choosing freely looks like. Not sentiment, not rescue, not charity, not the 31st number on a list in her father's ledger. A hand on the arm in the dark, left there steady. I don't need more than that. I never did.